G'day, my name's Jackson, and I wanted to talk today a little bit about my journey into becoming a software engineer because I didn't take a traditional path. And I know from experience that if you're starting out from a different career and you're hoping to become a software engineer, it can be very daunting and it can almost seem impossible. And I wanted to assure you today that it's not impossible, and I did it myself. And I want to share a little bit of my story so that maybe you could learn something from it and make that transition yourself if it's something you're interested in. Now, I started my career as an English teacher, and I was a teacher for 12 years in a high school. My background was in English literature, so nothing really that was relevant for software engineering. And all of my professional experience was basically around teaching English. I did manage to fall into teaching a little bit of IT, but that was really just because of a staff shortage at my school. But I didn't really have the background to make me qualified for that. I had to kind of learn that on the job as I went. Now, if you have a seemingly irrelevant background yourself, you might be starting to wonder, how do you make that jump? Now, in sharing my story, I definitely want to foreground the fact that I'm completely aware that I was able to make this transition with a lot of privilege backing me up in the first place. I'm a cishet white male, I'm bearded, in my 30s, so I had a lot of the other kind of signals in the background supporting me. I, for want of a better expression, looked like a software engineer. And while it's true I had a lot of privilege going for me, there was a lot that was holding me back as well. As I said, I did not have the formal education to support it. I didn't even go through a boot camp or anything like that with any kind of credibility behind me that I'd learned this stuff. And I had no professional experience to speak of. So those are three pretty significant things working against you. And I think for most people, those three things are going to be the biggest obstacle. So I hope that my story is relevant enough to anybody else that hears it, even if we don't look, exactly the same. Now, as far as my journey goes, as I said, I've been teaching, or I had been teaching, for 12 years. I'm 38 now, so I'll let you figure out some of the maths behind the dates that I'm about to give you. But I started learning to code. The first lines of HTML I ever wrote would have been back in 2009 when I first moved to Australia, and I was thinking even then about a career change. So I'd only been teaching for 3 years at that point. So I taught myself some HTML and some CSS from a pretty thick book called Teach Yourself HTML and CSS in 24 Hours, I think. It's one of those big Sam's Teach Yourself books. And it was written by Laura LeMay and another guy whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. But that was my starting point. I taught myself a bit of HTML, and I was able to throw together a very hacky kind of web page. It didn't have any dynamic elements to it, so I didn't know anything about JavaScript. I didn't know anything about PHP, but I was able to do that kind of like bare bones layout of a web page. A little later, I got interested in trying to learn a little bit more of what you might call real programming, and I picked up a little bit of Python. And the way I taught myself Python was to obviously follow some online information, but primarily the thing that taught me Python was trying to do the Project Euler challenges. So if you're aware of those, they're a bunch of mathematical challenges that if you have the ability to do some programming, you can brute force some of the responses, or you can come up with mathematically beautiful one-liners if you know how to. Mine were always really hacky, horrible implementations of code, but it was enough to teach me some of the basics, like how to use loops and conditions and all those sorts of things that are the kind of fundamentals across most programming languages. Around that time, I also taught myself a little bit about databases. That was mostly through the necessity of me having to be able to teach the basics of databases to this new IT class that I'd picked up. And in that, I was teaching myself the basics of relational database management systems. We were using Microsoft Access as our database management system. So I wasn't really learning SQL or any of the kind of the real information about like how you use databases as you might as a software engineer. It was more of a kind of database administration kind of basics. But it did force me to learn the how to properly set up databases and the tables with relationships that were normalized. So I was having to learn about how to create a schema that conformed to the third normal form, for example. And that was actually a skill or a piece of knowledge that became very useful to me in my career later. So that was, even though it was a long time ago, that was actually a very useful thing to learn. Fast forward another couple of years, around 2014, I started to use some of the Python skills that I'd learned to build some utilities that I could use in my teaching career. So without boring you on the details, there were some very arduous and mind-numbing repetitive activities I had to do just from an administration perspective. And I learned enough Python at that point to realize I could build myself little programs that would speed that up. And I had a lot of fun doing that. And I also built a web scraper because at one point our school was moving from one learning management system to another. And the learning management system we were using was all web-based, but it didn't have very good export capability. So all of these teachers had spent the last 10 years uploading all of their documents to the cloud onto this particular server. And then when it came time for us to transition over to a new one, they didn't have a good way to extract all of that. So I was really pleased to be able to use my Python skills at that point to write a little application that I could distribute to all of my colleagues. And with a little bit of, tinkering and some configuration, they were able to get all of their stuff out of the system. So what was looking like it was going to be a job that might take them days and days and days of literally just, right-clicking and saving documents to their desktop, they were able to run one little script that I'd written for them, and they could get their whole job done in 15 minutes. And that was just so rewarding to me, to be able to use those programming skills that I had for my friends and my colleagues to make their lives easier. And that's when I really caught the bug. That's when software engineering for me became not just something I was doing for my own interest, but became something I could really see myself doing to support people and to build things for people that they would enjoy and would make their lives easier. Now, while all of that was fun for me, it wasn't really ever enough to get me a professional software engineering role. So what I started to do very early on, around 2016, I started learning Java. And there is a wonderful Finnish MOOC that's probably still available that can teach you Java. And I started working my way through that. But as I was doing that, I was also made aware through, I think, a Metafilter post of this new-ish project called freeCodeCamp. And I think freeCodeCamp had only really started about a year earlier. It was in the days when there wasn't a forum for it. We were doing all of our communication through Gitter, which is a little bit like an open source Slack alternative. And I dropped all of the Java stuff I was doing, and I really started to dig deep into the structured content that freeCodeCamp provided at that point. The beautiful thing for me with freeCodeCamp was, firstly, I could sail through the HTML stuff straight away because I already knew that, and the CSS stuff I found quite easy. I also found the JavaScript section reasonably easy because there was so much I'd already learned from the Python side that I was able to apply. So it was useful having a little bit of a programming background. But the really useful thing was having those projects. So you can work your way through the challenges. But when I actually got to the point of making projects, making my first portfolio page, making a Simon game, making a tic-tac-toe game, when I started to apply what I was learning to those initial projects, that's when it all really started to click for me. And I really began to have the confidence that I could build these things for real. Around 2017, I started attending freeCodeCamp meetups. At that point, I was teaching myself React, which nowadays I'm a professional React developer, so this was a key moment for me. And the other thing that was very important for me, and I didn't realize how important it was at the time, was I joined not an offshoot of freeCodeCamp because it wasn't actually associated with it, but there was a group who still exists called Chingu, Chingu. And they, at the time, were a very small organization that were running these small cohorts. So you'd get together with a small group of people who were all at roughly the same level of ability as you, and you'd work together on small projects. Now, Chingu's actually grown to a much bigger organization. They've run many cohorts, and they're very successful in helping people do these kinds of projects. But this was still in the early days of Chingu as well, so we were kind of feeling out what that kind of project would look like. And I just happened to have a project that I was working on that I brought some fellow developers on to help with. And we worked on it together as a full stack app that we were treating like a real life product. You know, we'd had all of our issues and all of our to-do lists in Trello. We were tracking all of our working cards. We were communicating with each other through Slack. We were treating it like a mini company. And we were triaging our issues through GitHub. We were communicating with each other. We were giving each other code reviews. So even though that wasn't a real position or a particularly professional position, it was one that allowed us to emulate some of the skills and some of the experiences that we might have had we been in real workplaces. Now, obviously, the thing you really want to know is, how do you go from that, having learned a bunch of things about computer programming, having learned how to make full stack applications, how do you take that with no experience and get a job? So obviously the next thing I had to do was start applying for positions. Now, I started applying for positions in early 2018. So this was 9 years after my first line of HTML. And as job hunts go, mine wasn't too bad. I think I sent somewhere in the region of 10 to 20 cold applications to various companies. Of those, I successfully got 2 interviews, and both of those interviews fell completely flat. I wasn't able to convince them that I was worth hiring. One of those jobs in particular was really crushing to me because the position itself was so ridiculously easy. I was building, at this point, full stack React applications. I knew how to make pretty complex software, at least at a kind of beginner level. Not amazing, production level stuff, but I could build pretty good applications. And the job I'd applied for was little more than being taken on as someone who would tinker with the CSS on a particular widget that got dropped on a page, just so it could share a company's branding colors. It was literally just changing a few variables here and there, and then shipping it and being able to test it in a browser and ship it. And I couldn't even get that job. And when I failed that interview, I felt so crushed, I've got to admit. I honestly, at that point, was close to throwing in the towel. But I didn't, and I was very lucky that I didn't. I regrouped a little bit. I sent a message out on Twitter to ask some friends to review my resume. And I was very fortunate to have 3 or 4 professional developers review my resume for me and help me reword various portions of it, restructure it so that it would be more appealing to hiring managers. At that time, I also got the interest of a couple of recruiters, and one of those recruiters took me out for a coffee and just wanted to learn a little bit more about me. And he was able to give me some more tips that would help me get in front of the right sorts of people. And the best piece of advice he gave me, and the one that actually ended up getting me my job, was for me to start attending more technical meetups. Now, I had been going to the freeCodeCamp meetup for a year at this point, but everybody at the freeCodeCamp meetup is inexperienced. No one has a job. Apart from our organizer did have a job, but she wasn't hiring. And what this recruiter got me to realize was I was having conversations with the wrong people for my career's benefit. Now, the freeCodeCamp meetups were absolutely wonderful, and I grew so much as a developer just by attending them. But if I wanted to make that next step, I had to meet professional developers and be having conversations with them. So I went along to the Melbourne JS meetup, and the very first meetup I went to led to the connection that got me my first job, which was amazing luck for me. I just happened to start talking to somebody, and he wasn't hiring. He wasn't in a position to hire anybody, but somebody happened to know him, and he came over and he introduced himself. And I didn't know at the time what that meant, but the guy I was originally talking to said to me, "Oh, you should get to know this guy. He runs a consulting company." And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what a consulting company was. So I just thought, oh yeah, great. No, I'll chat with the guy. And I was talking to him for a bit, and he was asking me about the sorts of projects I was working on and what kinds of things I was interested in. And I explained to him the difficulty of being an English teacher trying to break into the industry, and how I was working on some React app that would pull in my GitHub portfolio information and re-render it on a page. And I discussed some of the troubles I had with that and some of the ways I tried to overcome that. And he just kind of nodded and smiled and, listened to me crap on about not being a very good React developer. And then we both went our separate ways. We sat down, we watched the talks at the meetup. And at the end of the meetup, he comes back to me and presents me his card and asked me to give him a call. So I did. The next day, I gave him a call, and he was saying to me, look, I'm actually looking for a React developer, and I think you'd be really good for the role. I'd like to introduce you to some of our team members. I'd like to take you through our interview process. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in? And then it was in that interaction, just this one-off chance conversation I had at a meetup, that set off this chain of events that eventually led to me becoming a software engineer. And I did work for that consultancy for 18 months. I've now since moved on from there, but that was where I cut my teeth as a software developer. But it was really that being able to go to a meetup and talk to people who would potentially have roles or would know people that have roles that was so crucial. We often hear how important networking is to getting our jobs, and it can feel like it's some sort of skeezy transaction where you're going just shaking hands with a bunch of people until they give you a job. But for me, I didn't even really notice that I was networking. I was just having conversations with people with similar interests. And I got lucky that the first time I did it, it worked. But I'm pretty confident that had that not happened for me on that particular occasion, if I'd kept doing that consistently, it would have happened. So at the moment, it's hard to get along to meetups because of the pandemic and the fact that meetups aren't really running the way they used to. But they are starting to come back, and that is definitely an avenue that you should be considering, and brushing up those skills and being able to pitch yourself to people in a kind of friendly, approachable way. So to recap, when I applied for my first job in 2018, it really only took me another 5 months before I got a real job. And to me, that felt fast, to be honest, because I didn't really know what I was talking about, and I didn't have any experience, and I imagined that I would be languishing trying to get these jobs for a long time. Now, if you're absolutely desperate for a job, 5 months, of course, is a long time. But of course, if you have work and you're just applying for things on the side, then 5 months is not necessarily a terrible time frame. But I did keep falling flat as well. And in fact, the time that I did get my job, it was actually just within a month. I met someone at a meetup, and then within a month I had a job with them. And to me, that almost felt like an overnight success. But it was an overnight success that was predicated on 9 years of learning vastly different technologies: HTML, CSS. I learned some JavaScript. I learned some PHP. I did learn some Python. I learned React at some point. I learned databases. So there was a lot of stuff I had to piece together in those 9 years. Now, a lot of that was ad hoc, and I was just throwing technical skills at the wall until something stuck. But I think if you follow a more structured program like freeCodeCamp, if I'd had that from the beginning, for example, I don't think it would have taken me 9 years, nearly 10 years to get a job. What does really lead to success, though, is not just what you know, but it's the way you are able to put yourself out there. The fact that you can present that to people. Something I haven't mentioned, but is probably somewhat important. I was very active in the freeCodeCamp community. I was a forum moderator for a number of years. I still technically am, although I hardly ever go there anymore. I was working with this Chingu cohort. So again, this was another group of people that I was working with, sharing ideas with and learning from. I was attending the freeCodeCamp meetup, which again was a separate group that I was learning from and picking up tricks from. And then of course there was the other kind of professional meetup that I went to. It's all very well and good sending out cold applications, but in my experience, those cold applications don't go anywhere. What gets you in the door is meeting people, being able to show them your best self in person, show them how excited you can get about what you do and why you want to do it. And you will find that people are much more likely to give you a chance if they can see that light in your eyes when you talk about the projects you're trying to do, rather than just reading a cover letter or reading a resume. I think there is a lot to get right when it comes to a resume or a cover letter that can help you get your foot in the door, and it can help you have conversations with hiring managers. But the hit rate of that is very low. Even for me, I got lucky, say off of the back of 20 applications, I got 2 interviews. That's still a reasonably low percentage. And if you want to have a successful interview, you're probably going to be needing to send upward of 100, good resumes before you start getting the kind of traction that I was able to get from one meetup. So once things return to normal and you are able to meet people and look them in the eye, I strongly recommend that as your path to getting your first developer job. Anyway, that's the bulk of my story. I hope somewhere in there you're able to find something that can help you. And if you have any follow-up questions for me at all, I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. I love helping early career developers get their foot in the door. I love helping people grow into their careers. I love helping people develop their skill set once they are developers. So if there are things that I can help you with, please reach out to me. You can catch me on Twitter at Jackson Bates, or you can leave a comment below. I'll be happy to get back to you and have a conversation with you about how you can make that step into your career. So thanks for watching.